Hey everyone, in this screencast I'm going to talk about classes and IDs, what they are and why you would want to use them. So with CSS, we have these things called classes and IDs. And what they do is they provide us with additional flexibility, reusability, and a way to be more targeted with how we apply our CSS rules or our style rules. The basic difference between the two, so we have classes and we have IDs. Classes are meant to be used multiple times in a document. So you would define a class once in your CSS, and then you would apply that multiple times in your HTML document. So you'd apply it to like a group of different pieces of your HTML content. Whereas IDs are meant to be used once, only once in your document. So they're meant to define a single unique part of your document. IDs, we've actually seen IDs before with within page links. When you have like a back to top kind of thing, or if you've got like an outline at the top and you're linking down to a different part of the same HTML file. IDs are used in that way. They're typically used to define separate areas of your layout or of your document. They are also used to add interactivity to your page. They're used with JavaScript. With CSS, though, the thing to keep in mind is that IDs should be used only once in a document. And along with that, we're going to be, over the next couple of weeks, using IDs to define a specific area of our document, for example, like the header or the footer or your main content area. So again, the basic difference, classes can be defined once and used multiple times. IDs also defined once, but should only be used once within your document. So I'm going to go over the syntax for both and then show you a couple examples. So what we're starting with here is, again, a very simple HTML document just with some lorem ipsum Latin text. I've got a couple of headers in H1 and H2, a few paragraphs, and an unordered list. And I have some embedded CSS up at the top. So far, all I have is a single style rule. I'm applying it to the body tag. Notice that I don't think we've seen this before, but the body tag is still an element that we can target. So it's a selector. Any HTML element is a selector. So I'm targeting the entire body. So basically I'm saying all content within the body should use Arial for the font. Okay, so let me start with the basic syntax for both. A class is going to look like this. So a class when we define a class in our CSS, we start it with a dot and then we define a name. So the name is completely arbitrary. It's up to you. You just need to remember what you've named it, because the second part is we're going to have to apply it within our HTML. So this is an example of a class name. Dot and an arbitrary name. I'm calling my class purple. And then I'm giving it any number of style declarations, just like usual. So this is my selector. My selector in this situation is a class. An ID, on the other hand, looks more like this. Same idea. We have an arbitrary name. I'm calling mine intro, but an ID, again, this is the CSS syntax for classes and IDs. An ID is designated with a hashtag. So hashtag arbitrary name, that's an ID. I've defined an ID within my CSS. Dot arbitrary name, that's a class name. So that's the basic syntax for each one. To use these classes and IDs, so I've defined them in my CSS, but now to actually use them, I have to go down into my HTML and add them where I want to use them, so apply them to my content. So, for example, I'm going to use this class name, this purple class, and apply it to this H2. To apply it, I use the class attribute. So we saw this a few weeks ago. There are a bunch of what are called standard attributes, standard HTML attributes. For example, title we saw. We have actually seen ID before. Class is also another one. That means it's a standard attribute, so that means it can be applied to any HTML element within your document. So I'm adding the class attribute to this H2 right here, and only this H2, not all of them. The class that I'm using is called purple. So these two things, this right here and this up here, go together. So you need to define your class in the CSS, give your style rules to the class name that you've created, and then the second thing is you have to add it within your HTML document using the class attribute. Note here that I'm not putting this dot in here. I'm only doing the name, the arbitrary name. But when I define it in my CSS, I'm using that dot because that dot is telling the CSS that this is a class name that I'm defining, and the name of the class is purple. So let me save that, and I'm going to preview my document. Change things so I can see both at the same time. So now we can see that this H2, I'm going to bring up my inspector here. This H2, which has a class called purple, has its text shown with purple coloring, as opposed to the other H2s which do not. So again, classes are meant to be used one or more times in your document. So what I can do here is I can actually apply this class to this paragraph as well. So now the paragraph and the H2 have the same class applied to it. So the idea is you're defining a style once, and then you're able to reuse it multiple times within your document. That way, if you decide that actually you want everything that uses this class to not only be purple but also be bold, you can just change it once here for the class, and it's automatically applied everywhere that class is used. Whereas IDs, so I've created this ID up here. So the hashtag says that this is an ID. The name I've given the ID is intro, and then I've added whatever properties, CSS properties I want to it. Now to use this, similar to classes, I have to go down to the section of my document where I want to apply it. And in this case, I use the ID attribute, which is also one of those standard attributes, meaning it can be applied to any HTML element. So I'm going to use the ID attribute, give it my name. Again, I don't put in the hashtag here. The hashtag is only used within the CSS to designate this as an ID, or in this case, the dot is used to designate that as a class. Down here, I just use that arbitrary name. So I've called mine intro, and now you can see once I add to this H1, ID equals intro, my font family has changed automatically. So again, I want to reiterate too the these names, a name that you give your class, a name that you give your ID, they are all arbitrary. But you do need to make sure that whatever you've given it up here in your CSS, that you're spelling it exactly the same down here. Otherwise, if I do some typos here, it's obviously not going to apply in my document. So those need to match exactly. The names that you use are arbitrary. As with everything in web development, file names included, everything is case sensitive, and you want to avoid as much as possible using special characters. So when naming your classes and your IDs, only use letters, numbers, underscores, and hyphens. That's it. Same rule with file names. Okay, so let's just go through a couple more examples here. So again, with this purple example, oops, so I've applied it here to my H2, I've applied it to this paragraph. I can also go in here and apply it to just one of these list items if I wanted. So now I've created a style rule once and I've applied it to multiple places in my document. So what we're doing here is we're using classes to give us more flexibility, reusability, and we're also able to get a little more specific. So without classes and without IDs, really all we're able to do is say all paragraphs are purple or all H2s are green or whatever. But this allows us to set some general styles for those selectors, for those paragraphs and for those headings, and then to get more specific with these classes. Okay, so let me just do a couple more examples here. So let's say that there are some words within these paragraphs that I want to highlight. So maybe I want to make them bold, set the color to red, and make the font size a little bit bigger. So I'm using the font weight property, color to set the text color to red, and then font size, and I'm using a relative sizing unit here. Remember that M sizing unit? I'm saying make it 1.2 the size that it would normally be. So 1.2% essentially is how that works out to be. So I've created a class, I've called it highlight, that's my arbitrary name that I'm deciding on right now. So I define it, dot, tell CSS I'm creating a class, here's my name, and here are the style rules that I'm applying to that class. So now within my document, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of randomly go to one of my paragraphs here, and I'm going to use that span tag that we've seen before, and so I'm going to say just for these words right here, I'm going to put the span tag around those words with a class. So the span tag is sort of similar to the div tag. So div is block level, span is inline. Both of them really don't do anything. They are meant to be used like this. So I'm highlighting text within a block level element. Without this class, span by itself doesn't, oops, sorry, it's this paragraph that we're dealing with, doesn't do anything. So I can't tell just by looking at that where the span tag is, but I can add that class to it. And now I've given separate styles to just that section within that paragraph. And again, because I've created a class, I can reuse it multiple times. So I can go down to other sections of different paragraphs and use that same class to highlight different text, different sections of my document. Similarly, let's say, so I have this list here. Well, I already used purple here, so let me make this all the same. So I have this list. Let's say I want to have alternating styles per list item. I can, because I want to use it more than once, I can go up here and create, oops. I'm just going to call it alt. I'm going to create a class name called alt, and wherever that's applied, I'm going to make the text within the element that has that class name, I'm going to make the text show up as green. So I'm going to go to these list items and apply this class to every other list item, which now allows me to have basically, alternating colors in this list. And of course, at any point, I can go and decide I don't want it to show up as green, I want it to show up as orange, so I can change it in one spot. So this, again, is very flexible and reusable. And maybe I want to add another style property as well. So those are classes and IDs. They are tools within CSS that allow us to create style rules more specifically, and they also give us more flexibility and reusability. The main thing to remember between the two classes are to be used one or more times. You create a style rule once, use it multiple times in your document. IDs are meant to be used only once. So that means in this example here, so I've defined this intro ID and I've applied it to this H1. This text right here, ID equals intro, should not appear anywhere else in my document. I've used it once and only once. The tricky thing with this, as with a lot of things in web development, is I could use it once and I could go over here and everything will look fine, but it won't validate properly. And there could be, by using an ID more than once, you could be bringing up issues if you wanted to use JavaScript at some point to make things a little more interactive. Again, when IDs are used, they should only be used once within a document. One other thing to keep in mind here is you can use, actually, let me, classes multiple times. So let's say I want this purple, actually this example is not the best, but let me get rid of that color property from highlight. Okay, so let's say I want this text, or sorry, this paragraph right here that already is purple. I could theoretically add another class to it. So it's using the purple class, and then you would put a space here, not a comma or anything, just a space. So I'm telling this paragraph to use the purple class and the highlight class. So it's now going to inherit all of those style properties. From purple, it's going to have color equals purple, and from the highlight class, it's going to bold its text and make the text a little bit larger. So you can see it's been applied over here. So you can sort of tack on multiple classes to a single element. And by the same token, you can also have both a class and an ID on the same element. So I've now, with this H1, I've given it the ID called intro and the class called purple. Okay, so those are classes and IDs. Again, these really are tools that give us more flexibility, more opportunities to reuse style rules that we've come up with. They can get a little confusing. The main thing to remember, though, is classes can be used multiple times, and IDs should only be used once. You can use them in combination with each other. Last thing is, remember that the names you give them, the class name and the ID name, they're all arbitrary. You define them. You just have to make sure that whatever you've defined it as in your CSS, you need to use that in your HTML. You need to use the exact same name to reference it within your HTML. So that's it with classes and IDs. Let me know if you have any questions.